Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're expecting about 200 of you to join us today, so we'll take just a little bit of time to let everybody into the room, and then we'll get everything started. All right. Welcome. Hello, my name is Sasha Sensor, and I'm ANCOR's Director of Education and Intersectional Collaboration. And I'm so glad you could join us for today's community conversation titled Humanizing Gender-Expansiveness in the Workplace. We acknowledge that conversations in this country around gender expansiveness are highly polarizing. So why this conversation? Why now? First, human resource professionals almost universally agree that when it comes to critical business conversations around hiring and retention in 2024, gender expansiveness is going to be a top topic. So let's dig a little bit deeper. According to one poll, an international market research company specializing in PR surveys, consumer insights, and opinion polling, there are huge discrepancies between generations when it comes to the topic of gender expansiveness. For example, nearly 1 in 4 Gen Zers use a non-gendered pronoun such as they, them. Moreover, the survey also found that young professionals are embracing gender diversity, nonconformity, and alternative identification in greater numbers. Case in point, nearly half of the individuals polled in the 18 to 24 age bracket said they now voluntarily state their pronouns on email signatures and social media profiles. When asked whether they were supportive of customer-facing workers being given the opportunity to state their chosen pronouns on name badges, more than half of the 18 to 24-year-olds were supportive, compared to only 16% of workers who are 55 years of age or older. Another example of this discrepancy is that 60% of Gen Zers feel schools should do more to educate children on gender expansiveness, while only 20% of those 65 and older share the same value. Because Gen Zers will account for 30% of the workforce by 2030, we think it is essential to help prepare our members for the organizational shifts that might be needed to elevate your already generous cultures of belonging, to attract, support, and retain this new generation of employees. This courageous conversation also continues the work of thinking beyond the binary started by our Asian and Pacific Islander friends and colleagues, Jae-Jin Park, Dr. Jeff Ramdas, Wally Tablet, and Leah Sung Jones. So today we welcome back Dr. Xavier Clark, the DEI and organizational behavior expert who joined us last year for a conversation around tone policing in the workplace. Emma Vosky, the executive director of Gender Nexus, who has been here before talking about gender affirming care. And we introduce you to 2 new voices, Claire Rung, a supplier diversity manager at the University of Minnesota, and the DEIA committee person at the Economic Development Association of Minnesota, and Ash Granda Bandaran, an activist, artivist, and student at Macalester College. They will provide their honest insights about how you can continue your work of creating person-centered workplaces with the sharing of lived experiences as well as tools for change. Before we get started, as always, there are a few housekeeping items, so let's get to them. Number 1, please note that this presentation is being recorded and that this recording, along with all of the materials we'd like to provide to you, will be made available via our ANCOR Connected community next Wednesday. Second, I'd like to draw your attention to the captioning option mode made available through Zoom. If you look at the bottom right of your screen, you will see the More button with 3 dots above it. Click on More and you will find the option to turn on captioning. Please note that this is not a certified human captioner, but rather artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is still learning, so there may be some odd or nonsensical errors in the translation. Third, We ask that you enter your questions for the presentation in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. There will absolutely be time reserved for the presenters to address your questions at the end of the conversation. However, if you've joined us before, you know that we have one major rule when it comes to community conversations. If you can Google it, don't ask it. It is important for us to do some of our own work and really leave the deep dive and the unanswered questions that are found through lack of a simple search to our members and panelists today. And finally, we have one last thing to add to the agenda today before I finally turn this over to my friends and colleagues to get this conversation started. This is what happens when your panelists have a long history with you and know a little bit of your life's past work prior to being at ANCOR. So they have asked me to do a little presentation around history today, and I want to provide a warning before Allie is so generous to throw our slides up on the screen for a moment that the content will be and may be triggering for many of you. So we'll roll into this relatively quickly. We'll go through it with the time it deserves and then open the floor up to our conversation. Allie? Take a moment to review this list. As you do, you'd be right to find yourself recognizing that these are a number of the systemic oppressions against bodily autonomy and self-determination we fight against in the disability world. However, you would also be right if you recognize this list as oppressions against bodily autonomy and self-determination that individuals who identify as transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, and gender nonconforming are fighting for. This is because of the interlocking oppressions shared between these two communities stem from the same places, Western ideology. So we're going to take a look at that. First is the scientific revolution. Yeah, we're going all the way back, folks. And this is where all of a sudden storytelling began to be devalued. And instead, we began to believe that quantitative data overruled the power of qualitative data. And thus, there was also this need to classify and categorize the world's life forms. As a result, we found ourselves in the 19th century with the birth of two new ideas, social Darwinism and eugenics. Social Darwinism is now largely discredited as a theory, but what it used to say is that people were subject to the same Darwinian laws of natural selection as plants and animals. Thus, advocates of this theory used it to justify imperialism and racism, as well as discourage intervention and reform. This also led to the thought process around eugenics, which is the unscientific study of how to arrange reproduction within the human population to increase the occurrence of so-called desirable traits. The eugenics movement, as we know, was adopted by the Nazis to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups. And these other minority groups included individuals who identified or were presumed to be part of the LGBT plus community. Folks, queerness and gender-affirming care are not a new topic of conversation. In fact, during this time, Johns Hopkins University and many other medical institutions around the United States were providing gender-affirming care. And in Germany, Magnus Hirschfeld, a German Jewish doctor, leading researcher, and early pioneer of the study of sex, sexuality, and gender roles, was suggesting a radically different view of sexuality and fixed gender roles. To support his work and the new science that was happening at that time around hormones, in 1919, Hirschfeld opened the Institute for Sexual Science. It was the first facility of its kind. It offered medical care, professional training, research opportunities, public sex education, hired numerous trans women as co-researchers, and served as a residence and community center for the LGBTQ plus community in Berlin. However, when Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Hirschfeld was forced into exile in Switzerland. The Nazis hated Hirschfeld for his pacifism, ancestry, and his ideas about sex, gender, and sexuality. And in May of that year, a Nazi student group vandalized the institute, including destroying much of his research archives during one of the infamous book burnings in Berlin. The even sadder and less told part of this history, though, focuses on the phrasing that I used earlier, that the Nazis adopted these ideas. But from whom? From where? The answer, sadly, is the United States. California was the epicenter of the American eugenics movement, and in 1909, California became the third state of 27 to adopt laws on forced sterilization and segregation. Ultimately, eugenic practitioners coercively sterilized about 60,000 Americans, barred thousands others from marriage, and forcibly segregated thousands of others into institutions. That probably doesn't surprise you. But what may surprise you even more is that nearly all of the coercive sterilizations, nearly half, were done in the state of California prior to World War II, and that post-World War II, they continue to be responsible for 1/3 of mandatory sterilization practices. So initially, eugenics would have just been regarded as bizarre parlor talk. However, the extensive financing of scientists at Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and Princeton by corporate philanthropies, so specifically the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad fortune, resulted in the mainstreaming of what we now know today as race science into the psyche of the American public. And it is the legacy of that influence that can be felt today in America's workforce. So it is now time to put the human back into the conversation and talk about the ways we can eliminate the systemic legacies of eugenics in our workplaces. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Xavier Clark to give their initial introduction, and then we'll move on from there. So Zay, welcome back to ANCOR, and thank you so much for being a part of our panel today.
No, thank you for having me. And so, for everyone that does not know me, my name is Dr. Xavier Clark. I am a DEIA expert, an accessibility officer, but also I am a behavioral change scholar. And so, reasons for me participating today in this conversation is I'm a gender nonconforming person. And so when it comes to the binary, I very much do not adhere to how work or standards of respectability tell me I am supposed to navigate my professional and personal life. And so I think a very big part of the conversation, especially why, you know, conversations on gender expansiveness have hit the top HR priorities of 2024, is that the landscape is changing. The people that are coming in and out of our organizations and who are already there are having more freedom to share who they are and being more open to sharing the language, but also sharing themselves in more expansive ways. So when we think about that concept of gender expansiveness, it articulates people whose body and gender identity and or expressions do not follow the atypical ways of being in a heteronormative society. And so I think HR, especially as practitioners and also as individuals that are working, it helps us understand the intersectionality of the workforce that we're working with, but understanding better language and how to embrace each other and understand that one person and the way that they navigate does not infringe on the way that we navigate. And so I think it opens up the conversation to allow us to be more empathetic. So a tip that I will hand to you all before I pass it on to my next colleague is being open and curious about who we are, to understand that there is empathy in the way that we show up for one another, and understanding that one person's story can actually make you understand your story better.
Thank you. Emma?
So hi, my name's Emma Vosky. I use she, her pronouns. In fact, I realized as I started to stare at my image, which is always kind of scary, that I didn't have my pronouns on there. So any of you out there, when you're on Zoom meetings, think about it. It doesn't always click for us. It wasn't until I looked down on the box for a moment. I'm the executive director of Gender Nexus. We are an Indianapolis based agency, the social services agency that serves all of Indiana. Our mission is to provide services, support, and resources to folks who are gender diverse and their loved ones so that they can live healthy and authentic and joyful lives, which is really what we should want for absolutely everybody who walks into the door of our businesses. My reason for being here is education, actually, and I'll talk about it in a moment, both to help provide education, but I'm looking forward to being educated today. So this is, you know, I think the only way that any of us ever get to know each other is by telling our stories, by talking, by listening to where other people are coming from, creating those bridges where we go, oh yeah, I get this. It's not quite my experience, but I have something else in my life that reminds me of. I know how this works. And in my book, because I am a little bit of an activist and an advocate, but in my heart of hearts, I believe that education is how the world changes and that dialogue is how the world changes. So having this opportunity is fantastic. It's not much that I can add as to why this would be a top HR priority over and above what Xavier said. I will provide you with my experience though, and or maybe perspective. Um, the moment that people no longer have to see their experiences within two boxes, it changes things. You can start asking questions. You can start saying, oh, what do you know? My experience doesn't quite mesh up with this narrative or that narrative. And that's happening right now. The boxes are breaking down, and people who are younger are more willing to challenge the boxes and say, to heck with this stuff. Let me just figure out, why can I not just be who I am, express myself in the way that makes the most sense to me, that makes me feel good, and how the heck does that ever change your life? And so, and there's always folks who are younger who are willing to ask those questions much more readily than folks who are as ancient as I am. Um, but, and so you're going to see it. The boxes are broken, people are going to be asking questions, and they're not just going to conform to the narrative. Tip for those of you listening today. This is actually exciting what's happening. I was on last week had a chance to chat with several of the folks who are also on this panel, and I walked away thinking, oh, this is so cool. Yeah, I'll talk because I always talk. But I'm much more interested in being on this panel and listening to the other folks, because your learning is not going to stop. And for me, this is an opportunity to learn all kinds of things. And those of us who were, and those of you who are in the disabilities field, you're probably familiar with this story. If you're part of a community that has been oppressed, demeaned, shamed, and forced into the closet, and finally takes a step out, what happens is an incredible growth of knowledge. People start talking to each other. They're not as afraid to talk with each other. We start arguing with each other about theories, and from that, knowledge develops. And so I'm looking forward to being here today, because even though this is the work I do for a living, I know I am going to be learning 3 to 4 times as much as I will be talking about. That everybody here is going to be offering that. Be excited about the fact that you get to learn today, and that that process is not going to stop with this conversation. And I think I pass it to Ash.
Yeah, Ash, welcome.
Right. Hey y'all, my name is Ash. My pronouns are he, him. I am what Sasha describes as a grassroots artivist. A lot of my work centers around change in curriculum in schools and also just overall structural change. Um, I'm so excited to be here, by the way. So thank you, Sasha. Um, as far as why these conversations are important, I do not work as like an HR manager or anything, but as coming from an employee perspective, this is something I wish like was a little more commonplace in places that I've worked. And these are conversations that happen a lot. So in places I've worked, we have a lot of like gender non-conforming coworkers, and it's I found that managers have a hard time navigating what to do. And so from there, you kind of it's sort of they're kind of stuck. And I wish I'm sorry, let me go back. Um, I wish that sort of this conversation had happened maybe beforehand. So I'm very grateful to everyone who is here. These conversations are not easy. And if I could really just be nice and quick about it, my tip for this is just to embrace the mess. This is not going to be a like one and done situation that like Emma said, we are always learning. I am always learning. I can't give a simple answer to everything, but I'm hoping from our conversation today, we can take away some really great tips.
Thank you. Claire?
Great. So I'm Claire Rung. My pronouns are she, hers. My job is I'm a supplier diversity manager for the Office of Supplier Diversity at the University of Minnesota. And in a nutshell, I help diverse construction and design firms and the businesses that support them to integrate into our supply chain. I'm also a committee person with the Economic Development Association of Minnesota on the DEI committee. And so I really think about these conversations and this subject, not just in my daily life as a transgender woman, but as well as in my work. And a big reason I'm here is I have a passion for trying to help people do the right thing, not just individuals, institutions, right, and organizations as well. And I think it's really important to do that now in 2024 more than ever, because, well, trans, non-binary, intersex people have never had more rights in the United States. We've also never faced this big of a legislative push against us. In many ways, 2024 is a defining year when it comes to this issue. So I think it's important for us to be, in conversation and arm in this. And really, my tip to you is remember, we're all humans, all of us, transgender or not, right? So, well, there's no universal experience for any of us. There's always a way to connect with people. There's always a way to find solidarity with people. And I would encourage you to do that as you listen to the stories and thoughts in this conversation.
Thank you, everybody. So let's get our conversation started, right? One of the things that we know happens in the workforce, especially for individuals who identify through a minority lens, is that loneliness can be a real challenge. We wanted to open up the floor today to talk about a little bit of that experience and what it means coming from a gender expansive lens. So I'll turn the question over to you all about what is perhaps unique or shared in the experience of individuals who work in less gender expansive environments when it comes to experiencing loneliness as an employee.
I can start us off. Um, as a very intersectional person, of a person being of a rural background, hard of hearing, being gender non-conforming, but also being an African American person, I think often people will think that my African American identity is what makes me feel less seen in the workplace, and that isn't true. Um, it's actually my gender nonconformity. And the reason I say that is we often don't realize that when an employee has the bravery to step out and show who they also become sometimes the only. And taking on that label of only is lonely. You start to not have people to be able to reach out to. You don't know who in the organization has your best interest at heart, or it also leads you to question if you're supposed to be there. And when I think about this as the intersection of disability and gender nonconformity, I think it, as we said, pushes people back into the closet, but also makes you not want to self identify. You don't want to self ID because you start to think that your body is othered in a way that there might be more of you there, but because there's not the representation out there, or people don't feel safe to have that discussion, it allows you then to feel like, no, that's too much of a burden. I have to put that on my shoulders and I have to be Goliath. And that just isn't always the mantle people or employees want to take up. And so they become lonely because they feel that they have to watch what they say, navigate in a policed manner, or think that if they say too much, it'll have an adverse interaction on their career. And so I think that is what leads to a lot of that loneliness.
Thanks, Zay. Ash?
Um, yeah, I mean, so I think we need to remember as human beings, we are multifaceted. We have layers in our identities. We have their intersections. As an employee, I feel like, again, a lot of people will assume, oh, this part of my identity is what defines me, especially as a trans person. And I think something important to remember is I define myself as trans, not just for myself, but for other people. These labels that have been constructed are not for me. They're more for you to understand. Um, and so in that sense, it becomes difficult when you sort of start to accept that label because in the workplace, you know, you get defined as either, let's say, for example, the Latinx person, the trans person, or the queer person in the room. And often, like, I've found myself to be the only queer person of color, the only person of color in the room. So then it starts to be an issue of who am I looking for? Who can I find that has a sort of common mentality with me? And then from there, not just like finding someone with a common idea, but also someone who also has a different ideal than you, you know, sort of embracing that connection and sort of that conversation where we do have differences, but are we only going to look for those, or are we going to find sort of our commonalities and embrace that conversation?
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Ash. I think, when I was in education about 15, 20 years ago, I had the very first student who asked me to call them by a different name than their parents had asked them to call them, and then also wanted to use pronouns that were not given to me by the official organization, right? And so at that time, I didn't know much. And the argument that I finally made in my head was I don't have to understand in order to treat somebody as a human. There are so many things in the universe I don't understand, but I do understand human compassion and empathy. And that feeling of others labeling me in a way that, like, I don't want to be labeled. That's not who I am. And so, you talk about that. And Claire, you mentioned in our prep conversation a little bit more about one label people forget is we're all employees of an organization. So would you mind talking a little bit about that thought process around the label you remember is employee, uh, this is what it means for us in our mission.
Yeah, absolutely. So in taking this conversation, I would ask the audience members to think about when other people recognize or introduce you, right? Is all of that start with or comprised about your gender identity? Well, the answer is probably not, right? I like to think about my job as a really good example. Like, yes, I'm a trans gay woman, and that gives me great experiences to think about how to approach diversity at the business to business level. But the reality is 95% of the people I talk to on the day to day, you know, they may not even be aware of that, treat that as a central feature. People know me because I am a supply chain manager. Even more specifically, right, I'm really good at business development. I'm great at connecting with people. So understand, right, what Sasha's saying is not just like, think about the fact of why people are brought here. They're brought here to work, not to like, functionally be a mascot. It's just important to understand myself, like probably anybody else. Gender is not the first or last or the main important thing that comes up as their core feature of identity. And especially in the workplace, I mean, I really think we should be thinking about each other in terms of like, what do we do and the value we bring to the table. And so, like, I'm very proud of being trans, and it's an important part of my life. But people in my work know me as a project admin, as a business developer first, even in a diversity focused job.
Appreciate that, Claire.
Just to tie back in a little bit, so that you're thinking about this in terms of your employees and the people that you're supporting. Um, the the cost on your employees who might be gender diverse of not being welcoming. So before my work as an executive director, I spent, let's just say, several decades as a business litigation attorney. And I, every Monday or Friday, when we had our weekly meeting, I would be sitting there in the conference room when I should be talking about other things, thinking about, could I ever say who I am to these people? Could I ever come out? And terrified of what would happen if I did. And I think about how much of my life was burned up. And if you're a business, how much of my productivity is lost because I can't just be myself. And for those of us who are gender diverse, we pretty much wear who we are literally out on our sleeve. There is almost no way to slide by. And so we're constantly faced with these questions. And there was Xavier who said something about, we don't want to self-identify. One of the reasons I didn't want to self-identify is because everybody already had formed this opinion of who I would be then. When I finally came out to my firm, because it would be a few weeks before I could do all the things needed to do to live as myself within the law firm, I had to bring photos of professional photos because I knew that there was this narrative that everybody had bought into a story of what it means to be trans, and that they wouldn't be willing to see me as just another business person, just another lawyer in their firm. So I actually needed to bring photos to convince them. And I shouldn't have to convince anybody. They knew me for decades. They shouldn't have needed that convincing. And yet I felt so unknown that I had to bring evidence. And then they still wouldn't look at it. Having to hide who you are is incredibly painful, and why any organization would want to have someone with whom they work, whether as an employee or client, have to live that way makes no sense to me.
Emma, thank you for sharing that. It's so hard mentally and physically to enter spaces where you feel like you have to build the case to prove that you are worthy. When, as Claire was saying, you should only be having to build the case that you are good at your job. Those are two very different things, right? Am I worthy of human existence? Or like, am I worthy of your empathy and your compassion and your humanity versus am I worthy of doing this job because I can negotiate a good contract or I have good time management skills or I'm a great people manager? Those are such different questions and have different impacts. Dr. Clark, I'm calling you Dr. Clark very specifically here because I know your research centers around a lot of the work and the impact onto the body as a result of the scenarios that, Emma and others have brought up. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about the burdens that get physically placed onto individuals and environments that are not supportive of gender expansiveness and how that might impact individuals in the workplace?
Yeah, and actually, I'll break that down kind of in two theories. Sorry, I got to put on the teacher hat real quick myself. And so, on the first part of it, there is a theory called minority stress theory. And minority stress theory speaks to that minoritized communities often walk into organizations, academic settings, hospital settings with more stress than our non minoritized partners. I use the term minoritized very specifically here because this is not just based on the race of a person, it's also based on the stigmatization category of a person, rural experience, for example. And so when you walk into any space at work and you can't show who you are, like people are saying in the comments and in questions, it really does weather your body. You walk in on fight, flight, and fear when you badge in every day, when you clock in every day. And so you see that people shut down and don't want to share who they are, because also, for the second theory, they've bought into the symbolic violence of it. In a lot of ways, symbolic violence speaks to gentle violence, things that we buy into as people that we say is okay. So when you see LGBTQI plus people say, I don't want to share who I am. It's too much work. I'm scared. that is them letting symbolic violence be placed onto them because of the actual violence and systems and structures around them. And so when we think about how we navigate into the workplace at no matter what identity a person hinges on, I know we're talking about gender expansiveness today, but any minoritized identity, when you come into a space and you're the only, or you're not out, or you don't see yourself, and you are continuously thinking about that, as Sasha said, you're not being productive to the organization anymore. The employee satisfaction rates go down, but also the productivity for the organization goes down. And so that when we're not thinking about that strategically from a business case and a human case, we are missing so much for the employees that we're working with, but also the communities that we are serving through our organizations. And I think that's the part that gets missed a lot when it comes to minority stress is there are second and third order effects that when Claire or Emma or Ash or myself can't walk into our workplace as our true identities, we're not doing the jobs that might be protecting other people, helping businesses, helping our communities in the ways that it should, that has long term effects, not just on ourselves or the business, but on people that we don't might not even know yet, or those trying to come into the organization.
Thank you, Zay. I really appreciate that. I always appreciate learning like the stuff that I don't have to like go to university. I can just call you up and be like, teach me these new things. They're awesome. And in the same way, I love that about you. I've always loved Ash, your outspokenness and your willingness to sort of speak up and speak truth, even when power is in front of you. And so one of the things I thought was really interesting that you just brought up, Zay, was this point about quiet violence. Ooh, that gave me chills. I've never heard that term before. And how scary. How scary is that term, quiet violence, on like individuals and the body? And so, Ash, that sort of brought me back to some conversations you and I have had in the past. And so, I'm curious as to, what your reaction is to that term, quiet violence, and how you might see that play out in other ways or other types of violence that happen in the workplace that you might want people to be aware of or speak to.
Yeah, so I think in term like, oh, that one gave me chills too. But as far as violence goes, I'm thinking also as far as going back to even in an academic setting and curriculum. I had a professor just last semester who was focusing voices around white-centered voices in a class on transgender theory and politics. And for those who are unaware, you cannot teach history on any sort of queer setting or transgender people without including voices of color. It just does not work. It doesn't happen, and that goes for any history in general. And so for that, that was sort of like for me when I hear quiet violence, that is a prime example, even though it's not in a workplace that was not something people had noticed. And other students in my class who were like cisgender, like just, they did not notice. And I remember bringing that up to my professor and being like, hey, is there a reason we're highlighting this in particular? And they were like, oh, no, you're just more advanced than the others in this subject. And so that took me a second. I was like, more advanced in the subject. And so that sort of translates to like in the workplace for me, just last summer, we had to do I work in a summer camp over the summer, and with different legislations coming out, we had to figure out how to address the conversation on pronouns for our gender nonconforming counselors and just how do we approach that subject. And thinking about it, I remember one of my supervisors being like, are we sure they're ready for this? And so for me, that's another like red flag. Hello, they're ready for this. So like we can approach different, like there are different laws, different like rules we have to follow, but we can't be afraid to approach this uncomfortable conversation or sort of recognize the different identities in the workplace because we don't think someone's ready. We have no right to decide when someone's ready. That's just my personal opinion. That's what I've experienced because when we start to do that, we eventually come to realize that said person we thought we were protecting, we're actually harming. because they could have taken this experience as a learning experience or just as just an experience in general. We have no right to deprive someone of that experience. So
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I mean, a lot of times I'll work with a wide variety of people and organizations, and they're always recommending, like, hey, Sasha, have you read this book? And people who know me know I read a lot. And they're like, what do you think? And my question always is, well, that's great. Are you reading authors on a particular perspective that are not considered to be white and mainstream? Right? Like, we can't say that it's only white people who are authorities on workplace experiences. So if we're looking at organizational management, are we reading texts from a large amount of different individuals who are bringing different experiences to the table, because lived experience shapes so much of the way we interpret data? So I think, that was a great point to bring up in the conversation, that alone, what we choose to use, what we engage with, what we claim as authority, those choices we're making are forms of that quiet harm and pain that I think comes into place and are part of those 1,000 paper cuts that just end up creating a much larger wound.
And Sasha, if I can jump in really quickly, I want to applaud the audience. I'm seeing some comments in the chat that I think are really good, like examples of this point. Like, for instance, if you don't provide gender accessible bathrooms and people are worried to go to the bathroom, that will literally impact your bowel health, right? And so, in the same way that we wouldn't tell a differently abled coworker or a differently abled patient, well, we're not sure you're ready for this right now, because it literally impacts their health, you would not do that to a trans person as well. And that's also a really great example of where you can find solidarity, even if you yourself are not trans or non-binary. So I wanted to shout out to the people following along in the crowd and mentioning some really tangible examples about how this plays out.
Absolutely.
Oh, and in the comment, God, these are great comments. So one thing, going back to something that Ash was saying, and then to one of the comments, when you ask yourself, or when you make the statement, are they really, I don't know if these people are ready for it. Maybe ask yourself if you don't want to have this conversation and you're just pushing it on to some, well, I don't know if these folks are ready to have this conversation. Maybe it's that you don't want to have this conversation. That should be one of the first questions you should be asking yourself. And oh my gosh, they're moving so fast. The piece of the energy piece of, and this is true of every minority, and it doesn't just apply to those of us who have to be gender diverse. The energy that I have to put into being the perfect transgender person, I can't have a bad day. I can't say something wrong, because I am responsible for every gender diverse human being in the universe, and you are going to use my mistake as your way of damning every other gender diverse person. The story of, well, I knew Emma and she was just really angry, I was going to use a different word, yesterday. And she's been like that. These folks, they're just this way. And it's always these folks. So there is so much energy that goes into not being able to be just a human being, like the other people in your office get to be a human being. And instead, I have to be perfect in order to make you happy.
Emma, we have certainly heard that from lots of different minorities who have come through about being like this extra burden of perfection. Because as you all said, if you have met one queer person, you have met one queer person. If you have met one disabled person, you have met one disabled person. So definitely not universal experiences, even though we are intersecting in the way that we sometimes experience the world based on our identities. Anybody else want to jump into the conversation around this topic? And some of the things that have already been said before we move on?
I'll leave us with like one little thing,
Yeah.
coming from what Emma just said. Having a lack of nuance leads to a lack of advancement. And I think the more that we are uncomfortable to be uncomfortable, it does us, it harms us. I would rather someone not have perfect language, not know my story, fumble through a conversation because it allows us to have a conversation rather than you assuming. Because if one thing the panelists can tell you about me, I'm very into fashion. I wear heels. I am a very confident person. You will sometimes be intimidated by me if I'm in the same presence as you. And that is just because I'm confident. And I think it scares people to think that I won't have a conversation with you or dismiss you. And I think it's giving each other grace to understand that we don't have to be perfect representations or even say the perfect thing for us to become perfect people to each other. Because the more that we show up for each other and just say what it is, I think the more we will have the ability to push back on legislation, push back on intersectional conversations, and help communities around us be more in coalition with one another rather than standing alone. Because there are overlaps. Like when I think of the disability and the gender expansive communities, there's a lot of overlaps. But because sometimes we're scared to bridge the conversation with each other, we leave out what could be. And so I would just say, get excited about what could be and understand that nuance is necessary to advancing the lives that we have.
That reminds me a little bit, Claire, and this whole conversation around being the role model. And one of the things pointed out was, Emma, a lot of kudos to that comment of 1,000%, Emma. You become a representative for an entire group of people when you are the only example of that kind of person that they have been exposed to. And, Claire, you were saying that one of the approaches that you bring to the table as a thought exercise for people who are trying to demonstrate or change their behavior is kind of about flipping that identity role model on its head and putting the responsibility on the majority members of society with the question of, and I'm going to turn it over to you because it's your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to give a little bit of a prelude, what Sasha's talking about putting yourself in the role model position, is I'll give a little context to the industry choices I've worked in. I've worked in trucking, construction, architecture, engineering. These are lovely communities, right? But you're thinking about a lot of different people from a lot of different perspectives, and you have to find very quick, efficient way to get lessons across. And more importantly than that, you don't want to just teach somebody or give somebody a fish, right? You want to teach them to fish. So I want to try to give you the tools to figure out what else do you need in your box to think about or speak in these conversations. The exercise that I have universally asked of my partners, of my employees, of my employers, since I've hit the professional industry is when you are talking about this subject, imagine that somebody close to your life, particularly a young person, is there with you. And what would they say? You can use this in any situation. Maybe it's you made a mistake and you have to think about like how can I approach a conversation better? Or maybe you're just put in charge of a presentation, but you're not sure how to navigate issues, right? I will tell you one thing before the theory or the thinking or the logic of any of it is all of us, when we talk about people we love in our life, and especially young people, we want to create a lesson. We will almost universally change the way we speak to account for that person's presence in the room and try to leave them with something that they can take away. But it's more than just being able to reach somebody at a human level. There are specific benefits to this too, right? Thinking about children makes us think about, right? People don't grow up bred to hate, they're taught it. So when you think about young people and children specifically, you're bringing yourself back to that place of what would I do before I had formed an opinion on this? The other reason it's important is what Sasha's getting at, right? Instead of putting somebody else in the spotlight to evaluate what should be done or what needs to be done, put yourself in the spotlight, right? If you can't set an example for a young person, how are you supposed to set examples for your coworkers or the people you work with? It's just not possible, right? And the final thing that this gets at is what we all have in common, right? One thing we do all have in common is we were all children, right? And we all grew up accepting and loving of each other. And in places we've failed, it's because we learned habits and ideas that aren't good. So when I ask you, imagine the young person in your life watching you have this conversation or deliver this lesson. Don't just think about it act effectively, like I want to leave a good impression. Think about how that thought exercise gets you to evaluate bigger questions, like how you are a role model, how you connect with people, right? So I promise you, if you want a tool to figure out what other tools you need, put yourself in that mindset. Try it, try it, try it again, right? Everything else will start to line up.
Ash, one of those other tools that you said that people should put in, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, is not only like think about the role model or the example that you would want for somebody young in your life that you care about, but you're like, this stuff's just messy. Bless this mess. So talk about that mind frame and how the adoption of the mantra of just bless this mess can really help people change their thinking around conversations that are not comfortable for them.
Yeah, so I guess a little disclaimer for those who don't know me. Sasha knows this about me. I am a very headstrong, we're gonna get this done kind of person. I will be 100% honest with you because I would rather give you the truth and us move on than sort of hide behind how things go. And for a lot of people, that's not exactly the, how they're used to sort of approaching life. And so with this idea of bless this mess, it comes from, I was a theater kid, it comes from stuff is going to go wrong. You need to learn how to sort of go with this and move on. And how are you going to take whatever little thing you believe went wrong and move forward? Because life, these conversations, people in general are not perfect. And with that comes the responsibility of deciding what is more important here. And with that comes, like, for example, with say there's an employee, this is from personal experience, who people have been like, keep them away from Ash. They're homophobic, they don't have the same ideas, whatever. Okay. That's not okay. So with that, there are two things. One, they have decided that I need to be protected from whatever idea is going on. And two, they have decided that the other person is going to be defined as the homophobic person without addressing why we might have different ideals. And with that, it sort of becomes this problem of we never get the chance to interact. And if you never interact with someone who does not share the same ideas as you, there's no way to come to an understanding or sort of hear another side. And with that, eventually you're gonna come face to face with someone who like that people are trying to keep you away from. And in those conversations and whatever happens, it might not be pretty. It might be pretty. Who knows whether or not it's from a lack of, understanding, or maybe it's from just a lack of sort of experience in those interactions. And what I came to find out later on with this person was they had not been around queer people often. They were raised in like very rural North Carolina, just like I had been, but they were used to that setting. Um, and after that, like sort of conversation that we had, it was, what are we doing? Why are we why were we kept separated for so long instead of being able to sort of just have a civil conversation and sort of go back and forth and have this dialogue where, yeah, we, disagreed on a lot of things. We disagreed on a lot of things, and it was messy for a little bit. It was, but we also got a like intense amount of sort of like we learned is the main point is we learned, and avoiding these conversations helps no one. And if you're afraid to have these difficult conversations, you're not going to get anywhere. So yeah, bless this mess. That's kind of where we're going with that.
Yeah, you know, it's for me doing presentations, especially in person, I really like being in the room with people who disagree with me. They often tend to be kind of easy to identify, but to me, it's like, okay, if we don't have this conversation, though, how does anything ever change? You know, then we're all still in our corners, and there's no way for us to start to interchange with each other.
Emma, talking about that, I'd like to push that a little further because as I've done this work, especially because, like you, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm also a 20-year veteran speech and debate coach. So people assume that all I do is argue my way through life. I don't think that that's actually an accurate statement. I think it means I'm curious and I want to know what the argument is before I make a decision. But I hear constantly that conversations where people don't agree equals conflict and that conflict should not exist in workplaces. Like that people are conflict adverse and that workplaces conflict equals drama and drama shouldn't exist in workplaces. So for people who sort of have that perspective, could you expand a little bit more about the benefits of having those diverse voices to listen to? Especially, I mean, you're an executive director, like so many individuals who are a part of this conversation.
Yeah, I don't know how any organization moves forward without conflict. And I don't mean people throwing stuff across the room or things like that, but if ideas aren't challenged, how do you get to the next idea? And challenging an idea creates conflict. People feel uncomfortable, but that's part of the learning process is feeling uncomfortable. That's okay. Calling people names, that's not okay. But saying, okay, I don't get this, and then having somebody come back and, you know, and there are tons of studies that talk about the benefits of having a diverse workforce. You know, and it's far more than just retention. It's higher productivity. It's getting to answers more quickly. You know, I just always think of it this way. If any organization, including ours, has a really difficult problem and everybody comes at it from the same perspective and the same approach and the same philosophy, it's going to take a whole lot longer than if there are multiple voices at the table, some of whom disagree with each other respectfully, but disagree. Personally, I think um, constructive conflict makes for good organizations and great change.
I love that terming it as a constructive conflict. Zay, you lead a pretty large team and have had a lot of experience. And one of the comments we're seeing here in the chat, but also something that as practitioners we've heard, and I will share, you are not the only one in this space who gets the comment, you're intimidating sometimes. So, my question back to you would be, there are true inherent power structures in the way that organizations are created, right? So when there is a power structure and somebody wants to go into a power space to talk to a manager, to present an idea that is different to the status quo or encourage a change from the status quo, what mind frame can managers bring to the table to encourage people to show up and not be afraid to engage in that level of conflict discourse, right? In that constructive way. And two, what does the manager need to think about regarding body language and response to ensure that that keeps happening on a regular basis and they can use that feedback in a positive way? And then I think, Claire, you're looking like you want to jump in there after Zay. So, Xavier?
Yes. So I think it's twofold in a way. I think first we have to remember communication is actually 80% of our body language. And I think when people come into a room with you, taking a step back to realize that they respected you enough in your position of power that they wanted to share an idea with you. Because at the end of the day, they could have gone around you. They could have jumped chain of command. They could have figured it out. And that's just honestly what could happen. But when someone brings you their vulnerability and their ideas, take them in to understand what they're trying to say. And I love what we say about constructive conflict. It gives you ability to also help that person develop what it is that they're saying. I think often when a subordinate or an employee comes into an office and says, "Hey, I don't like this. I would rather us do this. Here's my idea." Sometimes we hear, "I don't like this," and we stop. Listen to understand what they're actually saying. Don't listen to respond to what they just said, because I think the more that we understand what they're saying is the more that we are giving ourselves the ability to build strategy, build coalition, build teaching. I think when I first became a DEIA practitioner, I was bringing up a lot of stuff to senior managers about, diversity and equity and inclusion. And people were like, huh? Like, what are you talking about? We're happy. We're go lucky. We don't work in a utopia, though, everyone. And so the more that we allow people to bring ideas forward, you're one, doing development of that person, but also they're helping you to develop. Leadership is not a one-way dyadic relationship, it's a two-way. And so the more that you remember that that person can impart knowledge on you just as much to you impart on them, I think will take things to another level, and it will stop being a divisive discussion and rather become one where seeds of change can be planted.
So I'm gonna be naughty and I'm gonna use a $20 word when I could be using a $5 word. I want everybody to think about the term epistemic modesty, right? Epistemic modesty. What that means is instead of taking the approach that we know something and we're confident in that, we instead approach things with scales of confidence. We know this to be true to this degree. The number one way to prep an audience or be in a discussion where you might feel like you yourself don't agree with something is stop being epistemically confident. The number one way to open your mind and listen, or to take details out of a conflict or problem and use those for a solution, is you first have to be in the mindset that you could be wrong. You could not know things. That is also human, right? Epistemic modesty is not a term that comes from trans literature, queer literature, or disabled literature. It comes from a guy named David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times on a variety of subjects, right? But the idea is there is something universal about believing that we don't know it all. That's the first step to being able to usefully internalize that feedback. It really comes down to something that somebody put in the chat, Q-tip, quit taking it personal. It's not about you. Understand the degree to which you know an idea and be very conscious about that when you approach a conversation. On gender, on budget, it doesn't matter. That's a useful skill you can take in this scenario and apply it anywhere in your life.
Absolutely. I love that, whether it's on gender or the budget. Correct. Emma, Ash, anything you want to add here to this part of the conversation?
Just that I want the spelling of that word so I can save it for myself.
Fair. All right.
Yeah.
So
No, sorry. I mean, no, that's it. I want spelling. That was a big word.
It's in the chat. It's in the chat.
I love it. And I love that we're talking about these tips for engagement. And you all had a couple more during your prep session that I want to bring out. And I'm actually going to turn this back over to you, Claire. We sort of got around to it, but one of the things that you really mentioned was another mind frame tip is remembering that we're all here for two reasons.
Yeah.
We made a choice to support the mission of the organization we work for. And two, we all need money. We live in
Yep.
a capitalist society. We need a paycheck and we all need money. So, talk about how that sort of plays into your thinking around belonging in the workplace and as a tool managers can use to deal with these gender expansiveness questions.
Sure, sure, sure. So this is where I will do like a little bit of a history lesson, and in part because it's really what I'm invested in my family history. I want you to think about the level it took during the Second World War to overcome Nazi oppression, which, by the way, is how we started this conversation, right? A core facet of that was the oppression of trans people. Think about in the US alone, the monumental clash of internal civilizations that had to happen. You had segregated African American and Japanese units integrated into our military. You had people from all walks of life, some who had heard the same disparaging comments about Jews that started, right, Nazi logic. But the reality is we agreed that there was a mission that needed to be done. Our lives would be worse off without it. And the number one thing beyond, an engine of commerce or geopolitics you want to feed into an analysis of history, what it really took is a bunch of people with different interests saying, this is wrong, and finding ways that they can work together. Now, does that mean like the Allied approach during World War II was shiny? No, I mean, clearly not, right? The Japanese internment is definitely something to be recognized. But just remember, right? If white and black people in segregated America could band together to fight Nazis, you can find a way to get along with somebody who has a different gender identity to make a difference in the life of a disabled person, to push a little bit extra revenue. If my great grandfather could land, or I'm sorry, not land, parachute in to Normandy and D-Day, you can have a tough conversation and figure out how to work together, right, with somebody that you don't know what you have in common with. Trust me, we've as a society had to do way worse, right, in collaborating with others.
Claire, that's a really great point, and I appreciate you sharing part of that family history. We're going to have to dig into that later too, because my family was at Normandy as well, and lots of interesting stories around that World War II experience. It's amazing that a lot of times we keep coming back to that place for discourse and conversation. The other thing I want to throw out here is Ash, you mentioned at one point during our prep and before we kind of get to closing remarks, is that separation without communication is never the right answer. And I would love all of you to sort of take the opportunity to talk about key communication skills that managers and employees can use when in uncomfortable situations for themselves, whether that is being the person who needs to speak up or the person who needs to do more listening that people can use. And so, Ash, since this was your original train of thought in our prep, I'll turn it to you to start. Some things to talk about regarding communication in the workforce.
Yeah, so I think a big thing is, again, it's communication. Like if there is a conversation that you are unsure of how to approach, I think the best thing, like I said before, was don't make the decision on behalf of other people on whether or not people need to be separated, people need to be sort of kept away. Like talk whether it needs to be a conversation with both people separately, whether it needs to be sort of a general, like, don't make decisions on your own is sort of my big thing, because it happens a lot. And sometimes we don't realize when we do it. And I am also guilty of it as well, just in other contexts of being like, no, we definitely shouldn't have these two people interact because things could go wrong. Oh, well, things could go wrong. Like, if things go wrong, then you go from there. You can't plan for every single thing that is going to happen. There's just no way to prep for that. So separation without communication, I think, is a very common phenomenon in the workplace and in places I have worked specifically. And I think it's a failure on the part of management to not sort of address that and sort of navigate that in a way that is not that where both parties are aware, like unaware.
Sure. Claire, before we jump to you, folks, if you're thinking to yourself, absolutely, I want to go down that line, but when conflict happens, how do we resolve it? If you're not familiar with either restorative or transformative justice practices, I would take a note of that for your organization. There are great workshops out there around transformative and restorative practices and how, when things go wrong, people can engage with one another and move forward, because that's what we always want. So when we do our follow-up, I'll throw some text and some organizations that do that kind of training out to you all. But if you're looking for internal PD, I would say from a practitioner's lens, that's one of the most valuable things an organization can do and engage in, especially as we diversify the workforce. Claire?
Sorry, you had prompted me again. Can you remind me exactly what you're looking for?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just saying communication tips when
Yep.
it comes to what can we do to
Yep.
communicate better.
Yep, absolutely. Something we as a group all really liked was the idea of using welcoming language, right? Um, Especially when it comes into conflict, if you want to put epistemic modesty to the test and you want to be curious, right? You need to be conscious about language choices that welcome that. So I think we've already discussed, like, yes, conflict is important, and then like here's how you can incorporate that, right? But at a literal, tangible level, that means things like we welcome disagreements as a statement at the beginning of this. Welcoming language can also be like, tell us about yourself and your journey and what brought you to this decision point. Being curious and handling conflict and discussions doesn't mean just like having an open mind. Something that we learn in the world of speech and debate is like, it's not what you say, it's what the other person hears, right? So, I can't really sit here and give you a guidebook of like specific phrases to use or words not to use. Again, I'm really interested in giving you the tools to try to figure out what you need to use. But if you want to put curiosity into practice and you want to make use out of conflict and you're feeling headstrong, just remember the number one thing you can do is smile, have a way to find some common ground with people, and ask non-judgmental, open-ended questions, and invite people, right? Think about conflict management as not solving a problem. Think about it as an invitation to growth. And if you literally speak to the people you're dealing with, like you are inviting them to grow with you, they're going to feel comfortable sharing what they don't agree with, right? What they see as a problem, right? And if you can create a non-judgmental space to have that discussion, then you can round it back to like, okay, we'll examine that. And then, yeah, think about if a young person is here, would they want you to say that, right? All of these themes that we're talking about here, in many ways can be activated, right, by just finding ways to be welcoming to other people. So the number one thing you can do is don't learn a phrase book. I mean, obviously write some good terms down here, and some good lessons, but think about the next time you're in a conversation that you feel is going to make you stressed or nervous or anxious, regardless of what side you fall on this. Just remember to welcome other people, right? And if you, again, provide that non-judgmental way of having a conversation, people can feel comfortable sharing, whether they're, the trans person who's having an issue with another person at work, or a person who's just like not on the same page about where your company is at DEI, right? Everybody wants to grow. Everybody wants to change. And linking back to what Sasha said, we're all here to make money and advance our mission, right? So why would you turn off an opportunity to get somebody to that point, right?
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah.
Xavier, Emma.
And now I have it to use, so it really does come back to epistemic modesty. The trickiest piece that I have found for myself when facilitating a conversation, staff or interns or things like that, is I am so convinced when I come into the conversation that I know what the problem is, I know what the solution is, and I know how this thing is going to go. And that is a recipe for a disaster. Um, because the reality is we don't usually know. And I have been present for a conversation. And fortunately, I came at it in terms of, okay, let's be open. We're going to have respectful conversation. There is a difference between, oh, this is going to be a free for all, or people are going to respect each other in the course of this dialogue. But it went in a direction I never anticipated. Um, and it found a resolution. It also had a lot to do with the fact that the other folks at the table were willing to respect each other too, and willing to listen and willing to talk about those moments when something that was said just brought up all kinds of stuff and to look at that for themselves. Um, so openness, knowing that you don't know, that any conflict is not gonna be resolved by somebody coming into the room and blaming somebody else. You might just well skip the whole conversation. Nothing good's going to come of it. It's just gonna turn into a rugby match when all's said and done.
I would also, just to add on, I think this is a part I forgot to say in my last statement. You know, there is also, it's okay, like in those conversations, and something I would even encourage you from this panel, like it's okay to leave with more questions than answers. That's good, right? That should be part of learning and being curious and using Google and not the people. So, you know, obviously, as a manager and somebody who's managed personnel, if it's a safety and a security issue, and you know, we're getting into questions of compliance and administration, but the reality is 95% of the time we can avoid that. And it does take the pressure off to some extent. Let's say a conversation about pronouns. Well, maybe your group isn't so sure about like all the pronouns you can or make available or the medium. But you know, while we figure that out, let's just start putting a section on the name tag, and we can get there on the way, right? Sure, there will be like maybe clash of civilizations isn't like the most appropriate term anymore, but like yeah, there will be lots of philosophical disagreements that don't get resolved in one go. But that doesn't mean incremental progress can't be made. And if you take your pressure off and think about resolving the core issue and you know providing you know enough for you to then research or ask about later, that's not just okay, that's good.
No worries on the individual who just jumped in. As a reminder, we'll send out the information to everybody, but great points, Claire. And I think that's a kind of a great point to bring us to the last part before we go to questions and answers. Um, you know, as we were talking through this conversation very deeply, we all came back at the very end to the line that this work saves lives. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, small things or large things that we never realize can actually save a person's life, whether we know that that action has or not. So each of you kind of expressed that you wanted to sort of close this conversation in that way and talk about the importance of the life-saving techniques. So we sort of established an order in the beginning. So I'll just turn it over to you for that final thought to start.
Yeah, work takes up a lot of our lives, whether we like it or not. And so to be in a workplace where you know you are supported and that there are actions taken to ensure that you are getting the best that, you know, of anything that you can, and that this communication is there, it opens a lot of possibilities. And I think for me as an employee, if I know that this is where my leadership is going and the leadership and management is this is what their priorities are, I feel a lot safer. As someone who has a few years ago, I used to go to work and I would not like for something as simple as the bathroom, would not use the bathroom all day because I was horrified in the town that I lived in to like go to the restroom in public. And then I moved to a different company and they were like, yeah, we have all gender restrooms. If you need anything, let us know. We keep like different products in both like restrooms. It's little things like that that, and also just the ability to even sort of put your preferred name on things like that. I don't know. Yeah, so just little things make a huge difference on whether like just mental health as well, and how you feel going into the day makes a big difference, especially on the work that you do.
Thanks, Ash. Claire?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about this a lot in my day-to-day job in terms of thinking about the difference this work has on businesses. But when I think about the impact, just being able to create a friendly and welcoming environment for trans people, I think about somebody I knew through college who did debate at a rival college, and they lived in rural Kansas. They identified as a trans woman. And when I mean there was no support outside of debate, I mean nothing, like not even clinics to drive through, nobody in the family. I mean, they wanted to be out so bad. And everywhere they went, just shut down, shut down, shut down. The clinic, the parents, stores for crying out loud in a small town, right? And I had a conversation with this person at one point where they're like, I think the reason that I'm still alive is that debate and speech provides me the one place in my life where I can literally physically leave that space. And I can be around people who, even if they don't understand or even necessarily agree, will have an open and welcoming and non-hostile discussion every single time. Is this speech and debate? No, absolutely not. But you have no idea. One action or just a few hours a day in how you interact with that person, that could be the thing in their life that's keeping them around and hanging on. And I know that's, an upsetting thing to contemplate, but we did talk about this at the beginning of the presentation. This is why it matters. It's not just so we all feel good. It's there are people's lives on the line. And if their bladders don't fail because they can't go to the bathroom, then eventually other things in their life fail if they're shut out of society. It saves lives, and it's not just the physical health. Again, you might be the one thing that person has in their life that makes a difference.
Emma?
Following up on what Claire said, just this statistic always stands with me. Trevor Project survey within the last 2 years, maybe three. 40% of all youth, it's up to age 24 in their survey, who have one affirming human being in their life, are 40% less likely to consider suicide in that year. You have no concept of what just being a kind, decent human being to another human being is going to do. But the odds are that you are, if there are 5 people at your workplace who are gender diverse, the odds are that being affirming to all of them, and this is just basic human decency, you're going to save lives. There are probably at least 2 of those people who are going to be feeling better about themselves. And you know what? I also don't want you to forget, it's so easy to go, well, it's just the gender diverse folks. You're going to have coworkers who have kids. I think I saw somebody talk about a granddaughter, a family member who's gender diverse. And they're going to be thinking about, can I say that I love this family member? Can I put their photo on my desk? Or are you going to say, oh, I didn't know that you had a little girl. I always thought they were a boy. Are they going to feel safe enough in that workspace to feel good about themselves? There are so many impacts you don't even know about that are just sitting out there, and basic human decency is just so easy to do.
Thank you. Xavier?
And I would say, remember that your employees are your employees even when they leave the office. The best advice I have ever gotten, and I was a freshman in high school doing speech and debate, and it said, cherish their story, save their life. And it made me realize that when we cherish people and we cherish them not for the work function they do, but the essence that they bring into the rooms that they have the ability to walk into, you never know who could be saved. In 2023, there were 300 non binary, gender nonconforming, and trans people globally killed in the United States, in world. And in the United States, 23 people were killed. And that number continues to grow. And I think the more that we do not show compassion to each other, that statistic will continue to increase. And it will continue to allow people to dehumanize people across the intersections, not just at gender expansiveness, but along race, gender, disability, etc. And so the more kindness that we could show to people and just taking a moment just to hear somebody else's story and share that, show that you care about it, could truly change someone's whole perspective. And that person may one day become a CEO themselves, executive director themselves, and say, because of this other person, I was able to show and walk into the truth that I was brought onto this earth to do.
Thank you all. Very moving, very impactful. And we do have a couple questions. I just want to lean into the time to honor those. We have 3, so even if we go a little over, it's okay. We understand if people need to leave. But the first one is a scenario that was brought to our attention. That scenario is this individual is working in a pretty progressive environment at work. They identify mainly as more masculine, but in their home and personal life, they tend to be more feminine. And there are very progressive employees that work around them, like to joke around, oftentimes like, you're the only man in the room, especially because we're a very female identifying heavy community of executives and managers. So how do we kind of combat, or how does an individual bring attention to their manager about those types of identity aggressions? Any of our panelists, feel free to take that question. We'll do maybe 1 or 2 responses for the questions.
I don't mind giving a quick plug. I would just say what I'm hearing sounds like something we've probably all experienced in our lives in a different setting. Like you can have too much of the right thing or too much of the good thing, right? So it's great that if somebody says, I want he, him pronouns, that you want to respect that, but don't take it over, right? And I'm gonna give you a really personal example from my life, right? I came out as a trans woman later in life, and in the 2 or 3 years preceding that, where I was at personally, where I was at physically, the most I could bring myself to do was to display myself as gender nonconforming and ask for they, them pronouns. And so people are asking for you to treat them away for many different reasons, right? And so even though I myself have always identified as a trans woman, that for me was easier. And I've had experiences like that where they can take it too far. Like it must be great living on the non-binary side. And I'm like, I'm sure it is. I would not be the person to ask for that. I'm just doing this because this is what I can do now. So, right, don't overdo it. That's my biggest piece of advice. If you're the people who aren't asking this question, but might be on the other perspective of that, just do what's required of you, nothing less, nothing more. And that is really what's being asked. If people want to share more with you, they will.
Thank you. Zay, we have a question specifically for you. It says, Xavier, I appreciated your insights into the struggles encountered by gender diverse individuals, such as the pressure to go back in the closet. As Sasha mentioned earlier, a growing number of young professionals identify as gender diverse, and they also contend with potential ageism and challenges in being taken seriously due to their age. Could you or another panelist offer guidance on effectively addressing and navigating these interlocking forms of oppression regarding ageism and gender diversity?
Yes, and I actually think it builds on what Claire just said. I think that the more that we take time to understand the employees around us, the better. I think sometimes people come into the workplace and naturally we're just ready for them to get to work. We produce, 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 go home, come back, produce. And we don't slow down to understand who that person is, or you're seeing them feel uncomfortable in a meeting and are not speaking up. It might not be that they're disengaged from that conversation. It might be because there might be that interlocking oppression happening. My age and my identity make you think that I don't have the same expertise as you. I actually dealt with this yesterday. I was working with our facilities and security team, and I walked into the room in heels, in a suit, and everyone was like, "Who's that?" Because a lot of them hadn't met me yet. Also, just for context, I'm only 29. And so I'm a baby. And in a lot of ways, I'm in the meeting having conversation. And when I started to speak, they were, I saw the pushback of like, who is this person? You're not Dr. Clark. You can't be Dr. Clark. And I was like, no, I am. How are you? And I think that often until people see the representation, but also are confronted with their biases, those conversations can't move forward. And it also allows younger persons coming into the workforce to feel even more isolated, especially since most of them are on the gender expansive continuum in some variation. And so the more that you can allow them to express themselves, but also take time yourself to just get to know them, I think it will bring a lot more to help them feel better and people not excluding them unintentionally or intentionally from the workplace.
Thank you so much. We've got kind of one last question in this space and reframe it just a little bit. I hope that you won't mind. The individuals here who are listening today, they're not only employers, but they work with individuals who are not only disabled, but are disabled and members of the LGBTQIA2S plus community, right? Like there's so many parts of individuals' identities. Like, again, a disabled person doesn't mean that that is their only identity. Being queer isn't our only identity. So when you have staff who are learning how to grow and be valued, how do we have these conversations with our staff who are supporting other individuals who we're working hard to make them feel seen at work, but how do we help them when they're struggling on providing the same sort of support to the individuals that they work with on a regular basis? So what's that manager to manager feedback? And that's where we'll close out our conversation today.
I hate to be the person to jump on all of these questions, but I do think about that a lot in my job being primarily business to business related and looking at units. So the thing we're told over and over again in my professional development, whether that's the economic development component, right? The like really technical stuff like the RFPs, or all the way down just to like how we treat each other. You need leadership on board and you need programming, right? So many of you are going to have the skills you need to probably deal with that conversation like in the moment, right? And our hope is that what you take away from here will allow that. But ultimately, our goal should be able to like make normative good things in company procedures. So my biggest advice in that question is, I mean, think about for that conversation you're thinking about specifically, think about this panel and apply that right just to the conversation with that person. Guide them through the discussion, be curious, ask them what they need, right? But if you want that change to be institutional, if you want it to be durable, the next thing you need to do is you need to get out a piece of paper and think about what is my outline for making a program in my institution that resolves, prevents this issue, etc. I think about this a lot in economic development, right? Like everything we do is developing people to get better. It's not just providing them an opportunity in the moment. So that's my biggest advice. I mean, like, I have no doubt, everybody who watched this conversation will totally be able to have a conversation with other, employees or business people or units or firms. I have no doubt. What you need to think about is programming that and getting your leadership on board. I don't have easy answers, but if you approach it that way, you're going to get a lot farther than you would have otherwise.
Well, thank you to this entire panel. We're going to sign off, but there are so many people who wanted to give you all a little bit of love as we go out. So instead of it immediately hitting the dismiss, I'm going to let those comments and hearts and things flow through. Your vulnerability today has been incredibly powerful. We rarely see this level of active involvement in the webinar chat. And just thank you to all of you for being here and the work and the conversation that you've shared. And on a personal level, I'm very blessed to have each one of you in my life. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to bringing you back. and it keeps coming. Awesome. Thanks, friends. All right, we'll see you on the other side. Appreciate y'all. Bye.